once you've got your nation kind of set up in your starting location, then you're going to kind of keep tally of all of that on a campaign sheet. So the way that a campaign runs is you've got years. So the years play out in what starts with what's called the spring equinox, and it ends in the winter equinox. And there's a number of different turns that play out in between the spring equinox and the winter equinox. So we're in year one, turn one. And so in the first year, you don't have a spring equinox. Normally, you would start with the spring equinox, which is kind of the spells that you would cast for every banner that has a wizard or a magic user in it, in your capital. So if you have a wizard, magic user in an army in your capital at the beginning of the year, turn one, spring equinox, then you would get to cast spells. But moving past that, you've got it broken into banners, year one, turn one. Here's how it plays out. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to subsist or subtract from the food for each of your armies that's not in a place that has food present. So if you're the wood elves or if you're the beastmen, then you can feed off of the forest. You don't need a city. If you're the rat people, the Skaven, then you can feed your people off of the razed cities or the destroyed cities. But if you're not one of those, then you would normally have to feed from cities or fortresses or villages. And if, in the case of these two armies, you're not in a place that has a city or a fortress or a village, then you have to subtract, bringing each of those down a point for not having a place that's able to feed them. But for the ones that are in settlements, then they don't have to subtract from their food, and that gives them the ability in future turns to expand further out from their starting location. So after you've subtracted, you have to determine if there were any banners that didn't have the ability to subtract. So if you don't have food present and you can't subtract from the food in the city, then you're going to roll on a table and basically potentially starve part of your army. After you've finished feeding everybody or starving to death, then you're going to move into what's called the scouting phase. So we're moving from subsisting or feeding everybody to the scouting portion. So for scouting, you're going to look at every banner that's present, and that could be a banner on a tile or a banner that's in a ship. So if you have a banner in a ship, then that applies as well. And the first thing that you've got to decide is whether or not you want to expand outwards. So if you decide that you don't want to expand outwards, and instead you would like to see what's in that tile, then you go to an army that's in a space that doesn't have a fortress, a city, or a village, and you're going to roll on a chart. When you roll on that chart, it's going to determine whether or not that barren, nothing in it tile has a mine, which can only be found in mountain regions, could give you magical items, could give you gold to spend later in the game. You could find a temple, which again could get you more troops, it could get you gold, depends on your faction. Every faction has a different kind of temple. It could be a necropolis, which is kind of like a dark, evil structure that has good things and bad things in it, and you can explore it and see if you find something. Or it could have a wizard's tower. And wizard's tower lets you cast more magic and kind of have further reach of your magic. So again, so if you decided that a banner, so we'll say this one, decided that it didn't want to move out of the space that it's in, you could instead explore to see if there's anything else in that space. And it could be a mine, could be a temple, could be a necropolis, or it could be a wizard's tower. But if you decide that you want to move your banner, so like this one, then every banner or banner inside of a ship can scout an adjacent tile. Now, the same tile cannot be attempted again by another army. So if there's two armies in two separate spaces and this army goes to scout and fails, then that space can't be attempted again by this army. So it can only be attempted one time. But if two armies are in the same space and you successfully scout, then both armies can move in during the movement portion of the game. So what you're going to do is you're going to roll, again, 2 dice on a chart depending on what tile you're in. So it's either going to be river, valley, lowland, which is kind of the grassy areas, highland, which is the mountains, or a combination, and you have to choose one or the other. If you've successfully scouted on a coastal region and you find a city, then similarly to when you start your nation, if a city on a coastal tile is found, then you determine whether or not there are any ships present in those coastal cities as you're exploring outwards. As you're scouting, you have to be mindful of the terrain that you see present on the map. If you are crossing over a river and there's a bridge present, you have nothing to worry about. But if you're trying to cross over a river and there's not a bridge present, then you're going to potentially run into some difficulty, and you have to do what's called a route roll, which, potentially loses some of your troops. Similarly, if your army is passing over the mountains, you're going to have to do a route roll. Again, remember that the dwarves get a bonus whenever they do that. If you successfully scout a space that doesn't have anything in it, then you're going to have no problem moving in during the movement phase. But if you scout and there's a structure present and it's hostile to you, then you have to know that that's going to lead to a combat. So should you choose to move that army, it's going to initiate a battle. Similarly, you could scout and find, we'll say, a city, and that city might be friendly to you. Then you can move in and then immediately take control of that city and have ownership of it like you would any of your other tiles. But if you scout a city or a space that has an enemy, like another player in it, and you know that that has another player in it, then that's going to initiate combat just like it would if it was a structure that was hostile towards you. Once you have successfully scouted, you have to determine whether or not anything happens to your scout. So if you scouted a space that has an enemy banner, that is another player in it, then you're going to see what happens to your scout when they go to look at another nation. So you're going to roll again on a chart on what's called the scout skirmish chart. And so after you've scouted with all of your banners and you've determined where you'd like them to go, this one is staying and these two are moving. Then during the movement phase, you're going to move those armies in. So this is where you're going to look again at the different charts and determine if there are any kind of hindrances. So if you don't have anything in the way, then moving is as simple as pushing your armies in. So each banner or ship that successfully moved or that successfully scouts gets to move one space, unless that army has the ability to double move. And if there's any kind of blocking terrain, then you have to make that route roll that we talked about earlier. If you're moving from a space that has terrain to another space that has terrain, you have the option to stay on the same side of, we'll say, this riverbed, and then you don't have to worry about that route roll. But if you decided to go over here and cross the river, then you would have to do that route roll. And anytime you decide to, we'll say, in this case, go to this space over here, you're going to have to cross that river or not, stay on the side of the riverbank that you're on. So the armies that move into boats can be transported. So if this army moves into a boat, for the rest of the scouting and moving, you have the ability to kind of transport your armies through the boats. The ships can move into the same space as another nation, unlike on land, and do that without combat. So if you're in a ship with your army and another player is in another ship with another army, and they're in an ocean tile like this one, you have the option to move into the same space and not initiate combat and just kind of sail past one another. But in that same kind of choice, the mover and the person who's in the space has to make that decision. So the person who moves decides if they want to attack or not, and the person who's in that space decides if they want to attack or not. And if the person who moves decides that they want to attack, then they're the attacker. And if they decide not to attack, but the person in the space decides that they want to attack, they're the attacker. And then again, you're going to roll on a chart and determine what happens to the boats. Some of the boats might sink, some of the boats would be fine, but that is going to kind of wrap up the scouting and the moving portion of the year. The rest of the year is going to be combat related, and so we'll cover that in another video.